a brief introduction overview from Professor Hughes himself, and then hopefully some, cut and thrust discussion and debate around its implications.
Cheers. Yeah, I should probably say I still am associated with Cardiff University. I'm a Professor Emeritus, which gives me the dubious honour of having a lifetime link really with Cardiff, unless I really misbehave. And previous to joining Cardiff, I was at the Open University, where we I think made had quite an influence on shaping some of contemporary, especially more radical forms of criminology, not just in the UK, but probably without being too grandiose globally, given the reach of the Open University. So well, first of all, thanks to Mark especially for the invite, and also for all your work, Mark, in creating this living archive. Really exciting project, I think. Yeah. Just to say, I've now caught up with much of the previous network discussions, and very stimulating stuff, exciting stuff. And in the light of the previous network events, I'll adopt a hybrid of both the formal sort of masterclass presentation, as exemplified by Adam's splendid lecture on chaotic concepts and critical realism, and combine that also though with perhaps the looser question and answer format, which you developed with Andrew Sayer. In passing, I mean, Andrew Sayer's work's been a significant influence on my research theorising in the last 20 years since Adam actually introduced me to his work. And I guess in passing, it should also be noted that I do share so much of the claims to truth made by these two leading critical realists. I'll raise some questions as the extent to which Andrew's recent work is still necessarily critical realist, maybe in questions and answers. And I've also obviously shared much with other members of the network, especially those who've been associated with what we might call the Cardiff School of critical realism in relationship to crime and security, which has been developed under Adam's formidable tutelage. As I say, I'll try not to talk at you for more than about 30 odd minutes. And the talk, as we said, is based largely on chapter 5 of my 2022 book, Crime, Violence on Modernity, with the potentially off-putting subtitle, Connecting Classical and Contemporary Practice in Sociological Criminology. That's absolutely core to the book, I think, that subtitle, which I'll hope to elaborate on. I hope most of you have managed to have a look at the draft chapter, and with any luck, you found it productively provocative, and that will, as I say, hopefully come out in questions. Okay, so there's going to be three main elements to the presentation. And again, I would be very happy to field questions at the end of each part, yeah, of the presentation, if that seems better for people in the network, rather than wait until I've finished it all, yeah. So I'm quite happy, as I say, with the end of each of the three sections, we can break off for any questions that people might have. You often have questions, and then you lose them as the talk gets elaborated on. Okay, if that sounds okay with you folks, that's, I thought, the way we might proceed. Yeah, that seem okay to you, Mark, as chair? I've lost your voice, I'm afraid. Weirdly.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Great. So, firstly, what I'll do is I'll briefly outline the key aims of the book, yeah, and where chapter 5 fits in. And then secondly, I'll then focus on the first section of the chapter, beginning with its engagement with what I'd call the capacious and often overused and abused meanings of both the adjective critical and of the noun critique. And I'd like briefly to also talk about maybe my challenge to Andrew Sayers' use of critical in his more recent work. And then second, I want to discuss my departure to some extent, or some of my misgivings about the current state of critical criminology or radical criminology, which I fear has sort of become somewhat of a closed orthodoxy. And related to that, I want to make a defense in turn of the left realist criminological program of the 80s and 90s, and something that I think both Adam and myself have attempted to keep it being regenerated in subsequent decades. And as I say, I think there's much mileage still in some of the debate and agendas raised by left realist criminology, particularly, I'll argue, when it's fused with the long-term comparative Weberian and Elysian modes of sociological research theorizing. Quite a big feature of the book, I think. Finally, what I want to do, thirdly, I'll make a few points about the place of normative deliberation in social scientific practice, and in particular, its relationship to questions of value detachment and value involvement in the vocation of being a sociological social scientist. And again, that's covered in the second half of the chapter. Yeah, sponsored by Pellegrino, by the way. I don't know if you're getting any sponsorship yet for the network, but if we could, that might be a bit of branding. Okay, part one of the talk, the broad themes of the book. At the core of this book is a plea for sociologists and criminologists to talk to each other more, for their mutual, this is crucial, it's not one way, for their mutual intellectual enrichment. In brief, central to the book is a possibly over-optimistic call for a rapprochement, a coming together of these two modes of social scientific practice, which I suggest can be fused as sociological criminology. And it's as I say, it's a project that is also underpinned by the intellectual resources of what we might call classical sociological realism, both past and present. In particular, I've sought to explore afresh a long-held ambition of mine to test out how the intellectual taproots of comparative trans-historical and longue durée modernist sociological imagination might contribute to stimulating new, yet in some ways old directions for research theorizing and teaching in criminology, and indeed also to refresh a sociology of collective violence fit for our times. Throughout the book, I also challenge what I see as a long-standing and damaging division of labor in both criminology and sociology, between, on the one hand, theory and concepts, and on the other, methods and research. I think we've been somewhat blighted by the overuse of the term modern social theory. As a consequence then of this attention, not just to theory, but also to the doing of research and the methods involved in doing research, as a consequence, the concerns in my monograph are as much about what it is to undertake the craft of social science and to deploy the working methods of realist sociological practice. It's as much about that, the nuts and bolts, if you like, as it is about theory and concepts. It tries to straddle those often, divided areas of both inquiry and teaching. You do methods and then you do theory, yeah? Never the twain shall meet, with the exception, I think, of, again, of what some of Adam's work in Cardiff University, which I was lucky to be associated with as well as a co-teacher. Okay, so what do the chapters of the book cover in brief? In the first half of the book, that's chapters 1 to 5, yeah, including the one I've sent through. In the first half of the book, the key conceptual, methodological, and normative premises, as well as more broadly the intellectual resources of the classical sociological tradition, are outlined, and the latter's potential for revitalizing contemporary criminology are assessed. Now, central to these intellectual resources, and in my view, this is contentious, in my view, best exemplified in Weberian and Elysian research theorizing, i.e. associated with Max Weber and Norbert Elias. Central to these resources are the sensitizing concepts of power, process, and interdependence. I argue, again, very much in line with what we might call Elysian, or sometimes it's called process sociology. I argue that the central subject matter of sociology is always people in dynamic interdependence. In other words, what Elias terms figurational processes. Figurational processes can be, if you like, translated as describing the non-random assembly of actors locked together in a web of mutual interdependencies, both as allies and as opponents at times, and often literally chained together in long-term processes spanning generations, even centuries. So that's why there's an emphasis also on the long term as well as the nature of interdependence. So it's a fairly ambitious book, I think, and it's not going to make me many friends, either in criminology or sociology, probably. Quite possibly to be cancelled. We'll come back to that possibly later on. In the second half of the book, several substantive areas of current sociological and criminological inquiry are then explored to exemplify and test the theoretical, methodological, and normative claims proffered in chapters 1 to 5. So I have 3 very large chapters at the end, chapters 6 to 8, which home in on particular substantive areas of comparative empirical investigation, specifically on collective violence. That's the key focus of the book, really, is collective violence, much more than crime. Those 3 chapters, chapter 6 it's called Young Men, Street Crime, Gangs and Urban Violence. Chapter 7 deals with intergroup murderous ethnic cleansing, including genocide, and also focuses on the debate on state crime. Okay, that's chapter 7. The final chapter of the book is a bit difficult to say as it covering a particular area. What I do in the final chapter is I try and test, quite keen on testing, it's gone out of fashion. The idea we can have cumulative knowledge production that needs to be tested and changed and adapted and such like. In the final chapter, which I'm probably least satisfied, it's still work in progress, I think. I get to test the strengths and limitations of Norbert Elias's civilizing process thesis. And I test it in the light of recent research theorizing on interstate processes such as colonialism, warfare, peacemaking, and cosmopolitan human rights claims making. So that's the final, if you like, part of the jigsaw of the book. And I'm hoping that chapter 8 will become the next book that I write on empires and violence. That's the first bit of the talk. I don't know if anyone has any questions or points of clarification they want before I move on to focusing in on chapter 5 itself. If not, I'm happy to carry on through. So we carry on through to the other side, as Jim Morrison said. Yeah. Okay, let's home in on the chapter now, which again, some of you have hopefully had a chance to read. I hope the broad introduction to the book has been of some help, in situating where the chapter fits in, and maybe some of its seeming idiosyncrasies. I suggest, in the way that the chapters do all talk to each other and build on each other, so it's a little bit difficult sometimes just abstracting one out from the whole. Okay, I'd like to sort of begin. Let's firstly begin by discussing the meanings of critical and critique. I think this might be the bit that most people are interested in, given the name of your network. Though in the second part, I'll obviously also, in the third part of the talk, I'll also want to talk quite explicitly to that debate you had with Andrew Sayer as well on why things matter to people. That sort of much more thing about ethics and everyday life. Okay, so begin then with unpacking the meanings of critical and critique. As you'll probably be aware, I'm getting a little bit wary of the overuse and at times the abuse of what, I don't know whether Adam would agree whether they're chaotic concepts actually, but at times I think they are used chaotically. At times I think they're used and abused. Anyway, so what I tried to do in the first bit of the chapter, first third of the chapter really, and it's very much adapting Sayer's work, as I think you'll have spotted that. I'm not sort of slavishly, if I can word, I'm not just following his thinking, but he's certainly been a major influence, and I think his work on critical social science is outstanding. Yeah, it seems to me it's the best we've had. But adapting Sayer's work, I suggest there are 4 major meanings at play when we use the words critical and critique. The first one is I think we can dismiss straight away as being actually basically of no use whatsoever, and that's being critical of others' work or others' ideas. A lot of people say, well, I do critical social science because I'm critiquing Parsons or I'm critiquing Foucault or whatever. I mean, that is just the normal stuff of being an academic, where Parsons is very much right. Talcott Parsons, often viewed as a non-critical social scientist. Yeah, I talked to Simon about this earlier today, actually. Someone like Parsons, who has a reputation for being, if you like, non-critical or even a conservative social scientist. His work was critical of others and builds critically on the work of Weber and such like, and Durkheim. You might not like where he goes, but he's nonetheless a critical thinker, because academics are. It's what we are. So I think the usage, that sort of broad use, is really, it's not worthy of bothering with, I think. You name me an academic who isn't critical. In that sense of critical of what other people have said, what other researchers pointed to. The second meaning, I think, is much more, is it more dangerous? It's certainly much more trendy. And that's being critical of your own ideas and assumptions, critical of one's own taken for granted beliefs, perhaps, or being critical of being a man looking at something, or being a woman maybe looking at a man, less often seen as a problem, I think. This is the very influential, what's been called, if you like, the reflexive turn, yeah? And I think it's predominantly an inward turn into self, into interrogating self. So you now get, you can get articles written mostly about people talking about themselves rather than the people they're meant to be studying, which I find is a rather a dangerous tendency in social science. As I say, it's this reflexive turn, often associated with postmodernism and such like. And I think as Sayer nails it in his discussion of the reflexive turn, it's what he, I think, calls a timid sense of being critical. He doesn't use this phrase, but it's almost like Sayer's saying to these people who are obsessed with self rather than the nature of society and how that might be changed and challenged. Hey, reflexivists, you need to get out more in the thick of things. You know, don't stay contemplating your navel too much. Now, I think being reflexive in the broader sense of the word, in questioning one's assumptions, in terms perhaps of trying to avoid ethnocentrism, in trying to understand the meanings that other people give to their actions, which Weber termed Verstehen. To me, that's the stuff of normal, good social scientific practice. So again, it seems to me it's built in to what it is to be a social scientist. But at its worst, I think this emphasis on reflexivity and positionality, as found in postmodernism and some of the cruder forms of neo-Foucauldianism, the danger with it is that it ends up often, I think, with such critical social scientists, if they use the word scientist, that they end up seeing themselves as the chosen few who are liberated, with the rest of us discursively trapped as happy, uncritical sort of robots. So I haven't got a lot of time for that. The third meaning of critique, I think, is what we might call the totalizing critique of oppressive societies, normally focused on present day societies rather than those further away in history and such like. And I think that sort of the notion of a totalizing critique of an oppressive system is probably best exemplified exemplified by the grandiose and neo-Marxist critical theory, the sort of Frankfurt School. But it's not limited to them. It's spread much more widely now. The evidence in a lot of critical criminologists. Phil Scraton would stand out, I think, as someone who seems to see critique almost having a purity to it, the purity of being a critique of the system. Those who are critical of the system are somehow impure, almost sinners possibly. So you get true believers and you get sinners. I think that's a tendency, very strong tendency in contemporary radical criminology. An enterprise I've been heavily involved in over the years. Now, again, coming back to Sayer, I think he would also suggest that this tradition, critical theory tradition, and orthodoxy, is limited because it only sees the bad, it only sees the negative in actually existing societies. So it gives us a fairly skewed picture of the complexity of such open systems. And it's also, for Sayer and for myself, it's crucially limited because it's devoid of painstaking, open-ended normative debate about feasible future arrangements, social arrangements, new types of institutions. There's very little to say about what you might call positive, constructive developments that social scientists should be engaged in. Finally, on to the fourth meaning, and that's the one associated, I think, with critical realism, and especially with the work of Andrew Sayer, and I think, without putting words into Adam's mouth, probably where Adam would want to position himself. The fourth meaning, I think, is it's the best we've had so far by a long stretch. You might say, I would say this, wouldn't I, talking to a network called critical realism, but the fourth meaning is that of both being critical of the objects of study and of the real world. And also, coming with that, being attentive to a deliberation on alternative and indeed more progressive forms of social arrangements. You know, that's the big challenge, I think, that lies at the root of Sayer's book, you know, Why Things Matter to People. Tremendously important, I think. And as Adam put it in his much more articulate lecture than I'm giving here, to his network lecture, the meaning of critical should be, I hope I'm quoting you right here, Ad, the meaning of critical should be restricted to imply a more emancipatory social science, which seeks to reduce illusion. I don't know if I've got you right there, Adam. I think that's something you touched on in the lecture. As I say, I think that's the meaning of critical as deployed by Sayer, I would think by critical realists in the round. At other times in Sayer's discussion, he suggests the minimalist stance for critical social science is the reduction of illusion. But he also at other times argues that we need to, or we are required to explain why false beliefs are held. If you like, that's often called explanatory critique. I think that's really, really rather important. And as I mentioned already, he also ambitiously suggests we might also be needing to develop practice that leads us in a more progressive direction, as in the reduction of bads, and especially restrictions on human capacities, and addressing, you know, the balance of suffering and flourishing in human life. As I say, I have much sympathy with this position, but I would sort of ask, and I do ask, I think, in the chapter, how different is the mandate to reduce illusion and to explain why false beliefs are held? How different is that from what I would call just good old-fashioned demystifying sociological inquiry, which really doesn't require the adornment of the term critical? As I say, I hope we might come back to that. I don't know whether that was clear or not. The other thing I do in that first half of the chapter, and I won't go over in any depth on this, especially for there's a number of people I believe who are not criminologists involved in the network, and that's my arguments for sort of wanting to, it's not abandon them, we need to go beyond the current critical criminological orthodoxy. And I'll briefly say a few things about that, if that's okay. What I do recognize, I think, and it'd be crazy if I didn't, given my own career as a sort of critical criminologist in the past, I think it is vital to recognize that the radical perspective's legacy in criminology has brought political and moral questions of power, inequality, and justice into the mainstream elements, and thereby changed the whole field of criminological study irrevocably. Okay, I think that's really quite important for all the problems I have with it. I mean, that really is quite fundamental. But I do contend, and again, I'm not scared of going out, but I do contend that much critical criminological practice has now stagnated into a closed orthodoxy. with no-go areas, no-go conceptual areas, and which ends up producing what we might call a side-taking social science, if it can utter the word science, which it's increasingly unwilling to do. Politics seems to trump science. The current state of critical criminology, I suggest. In particular, I contend that this radical orthodoxy, which I do try and give concrete exemplifications of in the later chapters, okay? It's not just a straw man or straw woman I'm trying to deal up with. So in particular, I do contend that this radical orthodoxy is incapable of addressing some of the key empirical, theoretical, methodological, and politico-normative challenges which contemporary sociological criminologists need to grapple with. I do have a get-out clause, I think. I do argue that all is not lost for a sociologically infused radical criminological legacy. And in particular, I argue that the left realist program offers some scope for the renewal of a politically and normatively engaged, yet open-ended and both theoretically and empirically driven sociological criminology. Again, if we want, we can come back to how I've tried to use left realist criminology in looking at, particularly looking at the issue of street crime violence and young men and gangs, if we want to use that term, which I know Simon doesn't want us to. That's Simon Holsworth, by the way. Not necessarily Simon Avery. So the discussion of what it is to be respectively critical and sociological concludes, I think, highly contentiously, I hope, for this network, by a reaffirmation of the inherently anti-fixating, which is the Zygmunt Bauman term, myth hunting, Elias, and often subversive nature of all good sociological practice, which may make the prefix critical largely redundant and unnecessary. And again, I hope that is a big provocation or challenge. Do we need critical, or do we just actually have to become better sociologists in studying crime, security, and justice? Okay. I hope that's contentious. As I say, that section of the chapter ends with arguments against the claims of side-taking partisanship. You know, I firmly reject the sort of Howard Becker's very populist call for, you know, saying whose side are we on. I don't think social science is about side-taking. However horrible and nasty the phenomena that we investigate might be, and it can't get much more horrible and nasty than the content I discuss in chapter 7 on murderous ethnic cleansing. But I very much argue that we'll be thwarted in our ambitions as social scientists if we take sides in the debate, and if we indulge in what you might call blame attribution. And as I say, that's a big challenge, but I think it's a bit built into our vocation as social scientists. Okay, that's the end of part 2 of the talk. Does anyone want to come in with any?
Yeah, I think Adam does. Adam?
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, very provocative for a network called critical realism.
Of course.
Do away with the prefix and become something else.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with the depiction. More so in the chapter than just now of the fourth concept of criticism that you've talked about in the chapter, more closely aligned with, or fundamentally Bhaskar as much as Sayre. The criticism then is reduction of illusion, but also the avoidance of unnecessary suffering, which really connects to what you then want to go on to develop as a social science, which is critical because it takes suffering, but then also flourishing and the normative elements of that as central to what it is, to why things matter, why things ought to matter to critical realists, or anybody else, because ultimately we're looking to reduce our illusion, but also to avoid unnecessary suffering. And I just wonder, in those terms, whether it would be fantastic, wouldn't it, if that was just obviously the case, that what all social science would be about, and you wouldn't want any kind of critical prefix for that. But I just wonder how you think that relates to the kind of renaissance of objectivists, as in value neutral, overtly, deliberately non-normative social science, particularly in our own field of studying crime, security, and justice, with the rise of, or the renaissance of experimental and epidemiological approaches to understanding our subject matter, which see as central to good science, good social science, the bracketing off of normative concerns, which surely would then imply that there is a need then for us to define, well, what is what we would regard as a naively realist point of view, but indeed a critical realist point of view. Okay, so that would be the relax, everyone. The network's not over. Defense of the term, but also I'm interested in your views on other ways in which the concept of critical has been used, which are very pressing in the present. Yes, so gender critical, a whole argument about very vexed, heated debates about trans and gender identities, and how what a good social science is or isn't, that not only recognizes that, but is allowed to even talk in such terms. And critical race theory, again, which is becoming hugely kind of significant influences, using criticism in very different ways, perhaps the one which Bhaskar has outlined, and which I've just tried to reinsert there. So we have a kind of Renaissance experimental epidemiological approach to issues of crime and violence, which regards good social science as that which deliberately brackets off the normative, and that isn't just a sort of legacy or antediluvian approach in social science, but very much reaffirmed and reasserted in the past 2 decades. And then other ways of using the term of criticism in the present, which are very much structuring and shaping what can and can't be said as good or poor social science in highly political ways. I mean, we made a joke aside about being cancelled on our platform, but of course that's very central to the fervour with which people hold gender critical views, or the criticism of that of trans rights on the one hand, and also arguments about who gets to speak on what standpoint about ethnicity and race. Sorry, not my lecture, is yours. But anyway, that's just a bit some few thoughts. I don't know, others may have some input too. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll have a go at answering some of that. It's an ongoing debate, I would suggest. I guess as you know, you've read the book, Adam. I sort of try and I'll stick with realism. I tend to use realism without critical. And I wonder what problems there'd be for your group to just call yourselves the realist network. Okay, because in what sense is Nick Tilley not critical in his work? I mean, I find that a difficult one to square, really. Nick Tilley's work is.
Well, let's just pause on that. That's a really good point. To what extent does he take on board the notions of suffering and flourishing and the normative side, which in one sense, partly also because of his location within the Home Office, right, and wanting, if you like, to speak to and hold off the kind of a deliberately, avowedly anormative concept of science in that. selected the prefix scientific realism, perhaps as a way of smuggling Bhaskar into the Home Office, as I've said in other firms. But actual facts, was very, very cautious, anxious, I think, about using the concept of criticism. But that speaks very much to the latter part of your chapter, right? Of not actually grounding a kind of normative position in that century.
Well, yes and no. I think, by the way, one, it might be worth asking a talk to the group actually about his issues around critical as against scientific realism. Still a great communicator, I always think. Now, in terms of one of the things I thought about with Nick, for instance, of the case of Nick Tilley, then, as in my view, quite a subversive, demystificatory sort of social scientist. And when it's some of his more recent stuff on domestic violence, I thought that had all sorts of normative deliberative issues that he was raising. So I didn't think he was, he necessarily avoids them. And I take your point about we've written a lot together about the problems of the hyper positivism associated with the experimental turn. But I was interested, even there, I think I quoted a study by Sherman et al. On questions of deaths amongst ethnic minority groups in Britain. And even in there, in this, I think it was published, I've forgotten where it's got to have been the BJC. They seem to me, they do talk, the moral issue, the major moral political issue that we are not addressing the problem of young black men, especially young Afro-Caribbean black men, being murdered so much more than other ethnic minorities. Yeah. So even I don't know how utterly devoid they are of the normative and the political, and maybe we need to sort of bring that out from them. But I think the other major issue you raise is around the ever increasing number of versions of critical race theory, gender theory, critical convict criminology. Yeah, we've got whole. It seems to me we're getting a plethora of what I would call identitarian modes of criminological inquiry, and I think there's major difficulties with that. I can't say for sure, but when I had an abstract rejected for the British Society of Sociology, it might well have been because the content of the book was not seen appropriate now for the British Sociological Association's view that sociologists are now social justice warriors. Yeah.
So, Gordon, if I could just come back here.
I'm a little bit worried about as I say, the growth industry in critical studies of, as if other people who don't use the adjective are somehow non-critical. I really don't know what critical race theory means currently. Seems to me it's more like certainty about their beliefs and the wrongness of others. But of course, that can be turned back on me, and that's because I happen to have probably a certain ethnicity and a gender or whatever. That's a bit of a problem, I think, for the vocation of social scientists. It seems to me politics trumps science in this.
Amma, you've got a question? I think Amma has raised his hand.
Hi, Amma.
Hi, Gord. Yes, thank you very much. And a really interesting, really good chapter. Sorry, can you hear me? There's a noise coming.
Yeah.
From
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a few questions here, so hopefully I'll remember them all, partly because I'm following up on what Adam said previously, but also then your response to him in terms of, some of the examples we've been mentioning, whether that's identity politics, some of the words that have come up and including critical race theory. And so I think particularly my view is there's a need, as much as you say, for instance, in the book, that there's a need to avoid kind of, making a strong argument of, these engagements, right? Particularly my interest is, for instance, when we talk about, or when examples are being given, is identity politics, fracturing disciplines, and so on. The question I would, the beginning or the first question that needs to be asked is that those kind of endeavors, how did they start, in response to what, and so on, right? I think that's important to, again, empirically question the need for those directions in inquiry. And I think that's important. So that takes me to my question, which is the word critical. And I would relate that, one in relation to critical realism, and the other in terms of one aspect which might have been covered in your review of the word critical, but I think might have been a bit implicit. So how about like critical of disciplines themselves, right? As we know, if we look at the history, the long period of disciplines, they have certain assumptions. Most of them are, replete with very problematic practices, right? If we look at the concrete empirical histories of disciplines, some also implicated in perpetuating sort of existing unequal relations and so on. So taking a critical lens on whole disciplines as a whole, their object of study, their methodology, their historical practice, and so on. How would that take of the critical fit in with the review of critical? So that is one question. Yeah, sure. If I may continue, if it's not too many questions. The second one is in relation to the critical realism and the point you mentioned about is critical redundant even in critical realism if we take emancipatory demystification, explanatory critique, and also practice as good sociological or good social science practice. What I would say is I think the difference lies is in the fact that there's the specific ontological, epistemological, and even methodological assumption and practice that the critical realism brings forward, right? It's trying to, with those specific ontological assumptions, then trying to identify causal processes, mechanisms. I think that is the unique aspect of critical realism in my understanding, right? And hence the word critical and its take on realism being in opposition to, I guess, the long assumed approach about realism. So that's my second maybe comment rather than question. And the third one also, I guess, follows from these explanatory critique, demystification, and so on. So because you mentioned about, blame attribution, side taking, and so on, what about, like an empirically driven, descriptive, explanatory blame attribution, right? So for instance, rather than without any empirical basis, without any backing up the argument with any evidence saying this is good, this is bad, and this is the oppressive, and so on. If that argument is driven by empirically substantiated evidence that this is the nature of, for instance, the relationship between, I don't know, like perpetrators of genocide and then victims, right? Implicitly, there is an empirically driven, descriptive blame attribution, right? Like perpetrator, in a way, it's also value-laden terminology, if that makes sense. Hence, is there no room for empirically driven, descriptive, and also explanatory, if not implicit, blame attribution within your understanding of the critic. Thank you. I hope
Great.
that's clear.
Yes, it's clear. If I can, I'll try and sort of deal with the three elements then, Namaha. The importance of being critical of the sort of disciplinary history. Yeah, I think so. I certainly, you know, if you argue that some of the key early moments of sociology discipline are, say, associated with Weber. Now, Weber book, which is called, I think you've probably come across it, social, by is it John Holmeswood, and I've forgotten the name of the female author. Is it Umbra, I think, a surname? They argue that Weber, Marx, Durkheim, who else? There's a whole panoply. De Tocqueville, all of them were basically indulging in colonial discourse. And I have to say, from my reading of the same authors, I think that is utterly wrong. You know, I think whatever you think of Weber, he was a believer in nationalism. But if you read Weber on colonialism, you know, there's no way in which he is saying it's fine. But what he wants to try and say is that it is not unique to, in his view, that colonialisms have existed throughout many human periods. Yeah, and you know, basically, cruelty is not unique to a particular era. It's going to be like, okay. Simon is here, by the way. He's just come he's in the kitchen with me. Equally, I know someone like Elias is often viewed as a Eurocentric. And therefore the civilizing process thesis is seen therefore as irretrievably tainted by a sort of an imperial colonial context. Again, when I read the civilizing process, which I've done many times, there's lots about the nature of colonialism. Heck of a lot. I mean, he clearly sees the British and the French in the 19th century as indulging in colonial self-aggrandizement. Yeah? But he also says that colonialism is an almost inherent tendency of most human societies, whether they are, you know, African empires with colonial conquests, yeah, and such like. So I think yeah, we can look back to the nature of the disciplines, but I think we have to do it quite carefully. We have to do it quite, you know, again, looking at the evidence, not presuming that all disciplines are tainted somehow by their moment of birth. As I say, I would argue that sociology is, from the very start, a radically anti-colonial project, and certainly radically critical of most of the taken for granted assumptions of the period in which they were writing, not least the notion of a divine order, of course, or of a natural hierarchy. So I think we have to be careful about what we think are the histories that we are going to disinter. The second point you make, splendid stuff, by the way, Amaha, as ever, is a critical realism, that if I'm right, that it's sort of unique contribution and it's crucial contribution, why we must keep the word critical as well as realist, is because of the emphasis on causal mechanisms and the focus on explanation rather than just description or understanding. Yeah, I would say, and I would say this, that when I read Max Weber on the Protestant ethic and on the spirit of capitalism, there are causal mechanisms that he identifies. You know, it's an empirically based explanation. Might not think it's right, and that's of course, but again, so I'm not sure it is the unique contribution of critical realism. I mean, that's where I guess I see when I read Elias, I think he's quite realist. Yeah, and I think much of his work has been, if you like, probably critical as well of certainly of other approaches in which he sees often. He accused a lot of sociology of being very static. So, you know, he's an inherently critical theorist. He argues that process is crucial rather than static categories such as condition of the working class or whatever. So again, I think he brings a dynamism to studying, which I think speaks to that sort of work done under the umbrella of critical realism. So again, I'm probably closer, as you can imagine, to the way in which the likes of Derek Lader and Tony Bottoms engage with debates about realism. That's where I've sort of ended up, and that's partly I think it is partly about translation as well, about how you engage people in these debates. And I think one of the problems of critical realism, which we've all faced in working with it, is how you translate it, how you communicate it. Yeah, it can seem overly, I think, at times, overly sort of rigid. You either go with it or you don't, and then you're not in the group or whatever. The third point you make, a fascinating one, I think, is about how we might do empirical research on blame attribution. As I say, my position on that is, I think we and I guess this is where Sayer would lead us. You know, if we can work out objective criteria for assessing suffering and objective criteria for assessing flourishing, then we can accuse those institutions that are limiting flourishing. We can put the blame on them. I just think in most of our work, and again, I think it is exemplified in the brilliant book by Michael Mann on murderous ethnic cleansing, which I'd highly recommend to anyone who is interested in questions of genocide and state crime. You know, his position is, in order to do the work, I can't constantly be thinking, how can I help the victims as against the perpetrators? He's got to understand why people perpetrate these crimes. That emphasis on explanation has to always be foremost rather than blame attribution. So I think, sure, in other contexts we can in normative deliberation, maybe we can say, yeah, you know, what's going on in Myanmar is largely the fault of the junta, but it's not exclusively that. You know, be careful who we presume are the perpetrators. You know, as you probably know, in Myanmar, you know, Buddhist priests to the fore in the killing sprees. You know, it's not a simple state down blame attribution, which I think the important work of Penny Green and her colleagues sort of suffers a bit from. And it tends to see it all as top down. It's the state what did it, and I think it's often much more complex, much more. The nature of guilt and innocence is much more ambivalent than that. And I think that's where Stan Cohen ended up, you know, in his work on state crime. Again, if you read that, I think he really isn't sure about how easy it is to have blame attribution to the fore. I don't know if that's answered much of that. Shall I finish off quickly on the?
Well, Simon's got a quick question. If question,
great.
That's okay.
Yeah,
Real?
just a quick one. Thanks, Gordon. Thought-provoking, interesting as always. Just wanted to pick up briefly on the theme Amaha already raised about disciplines.
Yeah.
Critical realism tends to emphasize a kind of cohesive interdisciplinarity when doing research and theory and so on.
Yeah.
Whereas the kind of sociological criminology you propose in the book seems much more concerned with kind of disciplinary integrity and reconnecting with the disciplinary tradition,
Yeah.
sociological criminology and classical sociology. Do you see that as a point of disagreement with critical realism? Is that something you think? Yeah.
I was going to end the talk actually by talking about why I've gone back to my roots and why I've gone back to disciplines. And I was going to end by saying, unlike Andrew Sayer, and I quote, I'm not allergic to disciplinary boundaries. He said in his question and answer session that he was allergic to disciplinary boundaries. My argument would be, and he also says, forget disciplines. I'd say don't forget discipline. So you're right, you've nailed me on that one. When I listened to Andrew, especially when he was, can I use the word interrogated by Adam? I thought he was heading towards a discipline that he didn't name, you know, which is basically psychology, mixed with again quite keen on the non-social sciences, I think, as means of explaining. He didn't want to go near discussing what it is to be concerned with group dynamics, and that's where I think the discipline, that's what the discipline of sociology gives us. And I think if we start going too much towards not just interdisciplinarity but post-disciplinarity, I think there are real dangers there. Be careful who you let in. So I think disciplines are about boundary maintenance. And although it gets a bad press, you know, especially because of migration flows and all that, where it talks about boundaries, I think boundaries are pretty important. And, you know, I think sometimes we do want to struggle for sociology's focus on the social, sui generis social. So you're right, you've nailed me on that one, Simon. But yeah, that's not to say.
It's worth just pausing there actually, though, because I think that's just pulling together some of the really fascinating discussion here, some of the key themes. I mean, I think Amhar's right. I mean, critical realism, yes, of course, it has its interest in etiology or kind of re-envisaged approach to causal explanation beyond the experimental or you know, quasi-natural scientific approach. Partly what distinguishes it, but also Simon's suggesting or intimating there is it's a whole kind of apparatus, whole ontology, but a whole epistemology as well as how you investigate problems conceived as concrete, as unities of diverse determinations. Yeah, so it's not just a causal explanation; it's a particular, you know, concept of how one accomplishes a causal explanation, not isolating the independent variable in a quasi-natural scientific experiment, but trying to understand, perhaps to lift a term from Elias, the configuration of multiple causes and how they come together. But then the point then is that is sociology enough? Does it provide us enough of a kind of understanding of the various determinations, yeah, that could explain, if you like, the concentration of violence, which is the point I was making to Andrew Sayer, even in high crime neighborhoods? You know, the prevalence isn't that great. Well, you know, that's a problem. So therefore, in our field, violence, crime, security, it is the composition of the problem, who is actually involved in it and their relationships, as much as its context and its social structure. Yeah. So I think the whole point about and that, of course, that question is in one sense unanswerable. Okay, what Bhaskar means by it being an open system. But if you take that point that we don't like natural scientists operate in laboratories that we can control and undertake experimental approaches to causal explanation, but we exist in open societies and have to try and understand, you know, the configuration, unities of diverse determinations. Why limit our abstraction of what they might be to one particular discipline, like sociology? I think that's a really important challenge, and one can understand why Sayer has perhaps wound up where he has, yeah, in going beyond his own home, literally his institutional home in a sociology school at Lancaster University, but reaching out to other, you know, and then in the process of wanting to embrace that open system relations, becoming allergic to disciplinary boundaries, which he said is places too great a foreclosure on the abstraction of various causal mechanisms that could come together. That would help us, for example, understand the composition, not just the contextualization of violence.
Yeah, all that I accept. I mean, I would again, dangerous sound like an old colleague that Adam and I knew, Eric Dunning. You know, did Weber get there already? You know, I would think when you read Weber's best work, and as I say, the essay, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which as half the book is actually footnotes with the empirical debates going on in the footnotes. I think what he pulls off, and I think what the best sociologists do, like Elias and others, Michael Mann, is that they actually combine explanation, like the explanatory, with also the hermeneutic term. So, you know, I think Weber wrongly is often seen as somehow a non-realist, as an idealist. He's been accused of being a nominalist, you know, all these sort of terms that are bandied about because he uses words like ideal type, as if some of that means idealistic. I don't think it does at all when you read Weber and you study what Weber has to say about class status and power. So, as I say, I do think that sociology, more than possibly most of the other social sciences, I think it's the origin of realism, you see. Now that might be my fundamental error, of course. Yeah.
I got a great Eric Dunning story on this. You know, we always what joins a lot of us together, for the rest of you and others maybe watching this subsequently. At one point in time, passed through Leicester, you know, a very important historical centre for sociological thought in the UK. And I wound up living in the same neighbourhood as Eric, you know, and you remember him accosting me on the street in Clarendon Park one time. He said, "Edwards," right, shouting across the yeah, "Bhaskar is just ahistorical Elias," and then walked off. You know, that's a sort of typical kind of Elias, a typical Dunning kind of a response to that. You know, so he was, yeah. So he certainly, you know, he very much regarded that realism had sociological roots. But I mean, in all seriousness, I think the idea of disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, post-disciplinarity is an important question in how one kind of conceptualizes open systems, and therefore what are the relevant causal mechanisms and how they can be thought to relate to one another, and particularly relevant in criminology, which I think is best characterized, you see, as a post-disciplinary subject. Yeah. Well, as you very eloquently put it, and others, as a rendezvous subject, you know, in which different disciplines come and argue with each other. Which is partly what makes it such a very interesting intellectual field. You know? Sure.
I mean, I guess I'm trying to now, I'm just going to say, to be fair to myself, which is truly reflexive, part of the reason I've gone hammer and tong about the sociological discipline is obviously because in the way I describe it in the book, it doesn't exist for the most part in most sociology departments. Yeah. I think the post-disciplinary moment has already occurred. Most sociologists would hate to be called a follower of classical sociology. They now much more would identify themselves as, I think, as cultural studies or post-disciplinary studies. And I think it's been a bit of a tragic error, actually. You know, it's ended up with the big questions of inequality, justice, oppression, and such like being sidelines for studies of how people consume bloody coffee, you know, cappuccino sort of sociology, you know. So I've deliberately, the book is deliberately being provocative about what sociology can offer, knowing that currently this book will not get near hardly any reading lists in sociology departments, I would suggest. It might get nearer to reading lists in some of the criminology work, because I think there are a lot of criminologists who still think probably that the sociological gives them the best way into studying crime and control. I might be wrong, but I think it's certainly an important movement against that. The other modes of criminology that you mentioned earlier, Adam. Yeah. Shall I briefly finish off? Yeah, I don't want to keep you folks away from the ever increasing number of coffee shops that we have. Unfortunately, not the Dutch versions, but the British versions across most cities. The third part of the chapter, sorry, the second part of the chapter, which is the third part of my discussion, is obviously about the challenge regarding how we deal up with Sayers' notion of the normative turn in critical social science. And I don't know whether most of you have read Why Things Matter to People. It's a very, very different book, isn't it, from his other books, which were, you know, the early books, the 2000 and the even earlier one on methods. Again, he sort of hardly touches on those sort of issues that Adam has been mentioned as central to the critical criminological sort of ontology, it seems to me. Yeah. And I think that the Why Things Matter to People book is an exercise closer to Aristotelian philosophy. Now, whether that is that compatible with critical realism, not for me to judge. It seems to me that that Sayer, I think he's done a really important thing, by the way, in raising the importance, as he said in your question and answer debate. He said, and I quote again, "We can't do social science without being evaluative." And then he said, given there are things that are objectively good or bad for us, even with cultures. And that's a big challenge, isn't it, to the current sort of emphasis on don't be judgmental. So in a way, I'm contradicting myself in some ways with Amahar's earlier points about blame attribution. But I do think we do need to sort of have a serious engagement with moral and ethical questions about the capacity of humans for both suffering and flourishing in collective life. And I do agree with, I think, what Amahar was hinting at, that we need empirically informed theorizing about what it is to be involved in virtuous or vice-like behavior, or what makes up just and unjust systems. And that's as I say, that's an urgent task. I mean, some of our earlier work, Adam, has tried to do that, hasn't it? I mean, we have actually, you know, as you know, we tried to sort of come up with a typology almost, you know, about different types of justice, you know, the four different issues and what they imply. So I think that type of work is really important. And again, mea culpa in most of my early work, the two previous sole-authored books, you know, I got away with saying, you know, we need to be more concerned with social justice, or we need to be more concerned with how we create safer communities. But then that's when you end the book. Yeah, you end the book on this trope, call to arms, but you don't actually do it yourself. And I guess that's one of the crucial things which I think Andrew Sayers' most recent work sort of starts to ask us to try and get involved in. And again, I think I try and do that a little bit in the three chapters, especially chapters 6 and 7 on street crime violence, and in the stuff on collective violence, intergroup collective violence, often called cleansing. So as I say, I think such questions that Andrew raises are really important areas for potentially productive empirical as well as theoretical social scientific inquiry. But I don't think Andrew nails it enough, because I actually think that for too long we've left normative deliberation to the non-sociological meditations of moral philosophers and ethicists. And I think, you know, without looking to, as I say, to place blame attribution, I do think we do want to start studying how communities might be more, dare I say, more virtuous, or how some communities are involved in more oppressive, vice-like behaviour. And again, I've touched a little bit on some of those debates with colleague here, Rachel, on the issue of violence and local communing, you know. And I've particularly taken, I heard the quote first in Andrew's most recent book. I was particularly taken by Harold Smart's concern that the seriousness, and I quote her, the seriousness of sociology as a discipline seems to be compromised if it gets too close to the taken for granted stuff of everyday life. Now, she's not saying it should be compromised. She's saying that is the predominant view amongst most sociologists. Yeah, that you don't investigate the morals and ethics of particular social groups. You avoid that. Now, can we do that? Can we study, understand, and explain the mechanisms that create more vicious ways of living together? Yeah, I think in order to try and do that, we don't begin by blame attribution. We don't begin by having definite victims and villains of the piece. I'd probably over-egg the possibility of being detached. My dog's just yawned, by the way. He's obviously getting bored. Is our Bruce. As I say, I've tried to argue that the communing stuff, the stuff of living together, is very serious sociological and criminological business. And as I say, you hinted at it, Adam, that most practicing criminologists and social scientists seem to want to avoid looking at what you termed in your discussion with Andrew Sayer, serious attention to group violence, which is appears to be, as you call it, incendiary. And you suggested that, I think it was chapter 6 of my book, some of the discussion in that is incredibly provocative because of the current mindset of wanting not to go there, because we will know the possibilities of how it could be taken up by the Daily Mail or wherever, but not to discuss the realities of what it is to live in tough places. Yeah. We tend to always want to put the blame higher up on the state, and we don't look to the importance of the ways in which interdependent relations develop in particular geo-historical contexts. So again, that was the last section of the book. Just as a final comment, I think, given the scope and often unfashionable, if not somewhat dangerous claims in the book for the dominant critical habitus in sociology and beyond, I do think this book is a book that's most easily written in retirement from paid employment, and similarly at a distance from the organisation and cultural constraints which are to the fore in contemporary academy. I don't think it would be easy for anyone employed in a university department probably to produce this type of work. I previously described, this is where I want to come back to disciplinarity, which Simon Avery raised. I previously described the project as the equivalent to a vinyl moment, you know, for those, a vinyl moment in the life of music lovers, you know. It is a deliberate attempt by me to go back to my roots, the roots in sociology and of a particular type of sociology, the Leicester School, of what was often called historical comparative, macro sociology. So this book, it represents me trying to come to terms with having become a criminologist halfway through my career, and how it relates to the previous half of my career when I was a job in sociologist. What I guess the problem I've got, and I think that probably, if you might say, the fundamental flaw in the book, is that how many currently practicing criminologists or sociologists share such roots. So I might well be talking to, might be dealing up with a fantasy here about let's rejoin sociology and criminology, when arguably you could argue, and I didn't say enough in the book probably, sociology has moved possibly even further away from those tap roots of modernist sociology than some areas in criminology. So, ironically, it might be easier to be a practicing sociologist in the field of criminology than being a practicing modernist sociologist in the contemporary discipline of sociology, that doesn't normally even want to use the word science, never mind truth. Yeah, I think sociology has probably largely been taken over by postmodernism and cultural studies. So, as I said earlier, unlike Andrew, I'm not allergic to disciplinary boundaries. I think there are real dangers in the disintegration of disciplinary boundaries. And I conclude, don't forget disciplines. I've said enough. And I'm keeping you all from your supper, no doubt.
Thank you, Gordon. Would anybody like to ask any further questions at all? Or?
I'd like to come back on a few things. Thanks for speaking. Cheers. Thanks for speaking to us, Gordon. It's been great. It's been. Can't hear me? Did you say?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Have you got me? Brilliant.
Good to hear you.
Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks. Yeah. Well, welcome to our cult. It's nice. It's nice to have a sort of a potential non-realist involved rather than us.
I am a realist, not necessarily a critical realist.
Yeah, so this has been interesting to me. So in international relations, where I cut my teeth in undergraduate, Weber was always framed as the social constructionist par excellence, because we had Alexander Wendt writing a social construction theory of international relations. And for me, it was interesting when you brought in Aristotle earlier, because he ultimately is the origins of realism and causation for me. Obviously, Marx wrote his PhD thesis on Greek philosophy. And then for me, the Marxist political economists take on realism and take on causation. A lot of the stuff in Conditions of the Working Class and Capital, for me, is a lot more of a sort of realist project, let's say, than Weber. And I think when you were defending Weber, who I know more about than Elias, so I'm not going to touch on him because obviously that's your turf. Weber's very much works in the empirical realm, let's say, and you mentioned empirical research when we were talking about that. And I think a few terms that have been missing from our debate so far that Adam's discussed, and so has Amahar, when we've been talking about the ontology of etiology and things, what we've missed out here is a retroduction, so the abstraction into the realms of the real, the actual, and the empirical. And we have, Adam and Amahar have talked about this, but I don't think that Weber has that depth ontology. He doesn't have the retroduction of the actual, of the real, the actual, and the empirical to my knowledge. And the reason why we can't just call ourselves realists, as in say naive realists, or as in going back to what you were saying about Pawson and Tilley's work, the reason why they're not critical realists in my mind is that, of course, critical realism is the compounding of transcendental realism and critical naturalism when it first began. And the idea is here that things are occurring in the realms of the real and the actual, and as empiricist researchers, we can't necessarily get to that ontological strata without using retroduction or as abstract theory. I was wondering whether that your thoughts on that, your take on that, what's Weber and Marx and retroduction, and really in a response to Tilly, why I wouldn't necessarily call him a critical realist. As we joked earlier, he smuggled Bashgar in under the auspices of scientific realism to appear more congenial to the Home Office, which he had such close proximity with. But obviously that work, he couldn't critique, say, abstract notions or concepts of austerity, the new penology, penal populism, privatization, the marketization of matters, because that might ultimately problematize his paycheck. So it's much easier to draw on ideas of crime prevention through environmental design and situational crime prevention and matters of, say, CCTV in car parks and all those kind of ideas, which I have no problem with. But to me, that's where the critical comes in, the unobservable facets and mechanisms through the retroduction. And Weber doesn't have that explanatory or conceptual framework, and Tilly was very much, Porcelain Tilly, 1998, sorry, very much realist light without the critical, I guess, would be my comeback on some of that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Again, I'd say, you know, do try and get Nick to make explain his what was there that much politicking going on. I know he did say to me, you know, it's good having the likes of me and Adam. We can get it on and off the bus. You know, he's on the bus as a bloody bus conductor, he said. So yeah, there is all I mean, they're also realist then in that sense, isn't he? You know, having to deal up with the Home Office and actually getting some fairly quite progressive stuff through at times on domestic.
A political realist, or perhaps a left realist, an empirical realist, but not necessarily a, say, ontological.
No, sure,
realist, perhaps.
I mean, retroduction, I'm not always quite sure what it means. Quite a difficult word to translate, I think. In terms of it,
so rather than inductive or deductive,
abstraction, you know, the importance of abstraction as intellectual labour, which I know Adam quite rightly emphasised in his lecture. Wow, I mean, they did a lot of abstraction. Yeah, I mean, if you read, you know, the essay "Class, Status, and Power," it appears to, you know, what underpins that is a wealth of empirical and theoretical work that he'd already done. And I think one of the problems we've got with Weber is that the way he was translated and who he was translated by, yeah, Talcott Parsons, that we actually had a personification of Weber. I think that reading Weber, if you read Weber without that sort of, without the Parsonian sort of take, and indeed without Weber wrongly being viewed as a sort of an idealistic social constructionist, I think you see you'll see a very different Weber. Again, if you read the world religions stuff, I mean, again, earlier claims that, you know, have been made that Weber somehow was a you know, purely Western orientated thinker when he did more work about Islam and China than any subsequent social scientist that I know of, you know, in his body of work. So I do think Weber does a heck of a lot of that abstract intellectual labour, and I think the same is true of Elias. But there is, I mean, a danger. What I don't want to do, the danger of being seen as someone who just says, yeah, but we've got to go back to Weber or Elias. That's as bad as saying we've got to go back to Bashgar. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know where Bashgar ended up in his later intellectual pursuits, but it did seem rather strange to me.
Yeah, definitely.
So, you know, I don't think we want to personalize it as, you know, this was what Tilly was like as a person, or what Bashgar was like, or what Weber was like, or Elias, who I knew. You know, he was a bloody annoying old fella, you know. You know, and he annoyed people. He knew he was right. I imagine that's probably the same as Bashgar. So they're probably very similar.
Yeah.
I don't know if they ever met. They probably have got on well, you know. Both certain in the rightness of their beliefs. So as I say, Yeah, I think it's great. It's great that you're finding the critical realist ontology a really helpful one in which to pursue your work as researchers and teachers. But I'd be interested, how does it work as a teacher? How does it translate?
Yeah, I can definitely
How
speak
can we
to
make
that.
it translate? How can we make it translate?
I can definitely speak to that as somebody that does, and it's a bloody challenge when you've got undergraduates sat there. So that was really just a more mundane point, I suppose, that came to me during the discussion. But another point I'd like to make is when reading your work, which I found actually a really nice experience. I think you're making these points in a very nuanced and subtle way. I've read chapters 5 and 7 in particular.
Right.
And what I found is that I was drawing parallels actually with Garland in his classic work, 2001, draws attention to how so-called penal welfarism and the rehabilitative ideal was eclipsed, or the crisis there, or the collapse of it, and how that collapse came about, and the replacement with market forces and so-called neoliberal penality and the new penology, Feely and Simon's concepts of the new penology and new punitiveness, populism. I saw a parallel, or I felt a parallel in your work that I wonder whether it was an inversion tendency, because Garland draws attention to the fact that the new criminologists of the 70s, so the original Marxists before the left realists came along and gave them that nuanced critique, the new criminologists, the Marxists, were critiquing penal welfarism from an academic standpoint for being positivist, for not being radical enough, for being only reformist, for and also not realizing how good they had it. Yeah, not realizing that that was the well-funded post-war social democratic era, and things weren't going to be that good again. And of course, what the new criminologists didn't know at that point was that the Reaganites, Thatcherism, market forces were going to come along and hijack that revolution, and things were going to get a whole lot worse. And what we end up with really is neoliberal penality, or the market forces and privatization of criminal justice, and so on and so forth. Are you worried at all, apprehensive that your devastating critique on critical criminology, which to some extent I share with you, because well, I won't go into these details because it's being recorded. I always have to email Mark afterwards and say, can you edit this out? So I'm going to stop there. But in some elements, I definitely share your feelings on this. And also there's parallels, of course. We're probably not far away from another new Labour government. Are you worried that your devastating critique of critical criminology, what if that your academic revolution that you're driving is then hijacked, and we have ultimately, rather than a left realist reality, a right realist outcome? For instance, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, a difficulty with so-called identity politics, problems with critical race theory. Well, of course, these are the key arguments of, at the moment, the far right, fueled by Trump and others, which obviously we don't associate ourselves with. You don't associate yourself with whatsoever. But in a galaxy far, far away, or a parallel universe, if those people were reading your work, they could say, oh, hang on a minute, this guy's against these things as well. Look at this, we can cite him. This Professor Emeritus of a Russell Group University, we can cite this work to launch our critique on the critical criminologists, and then you'll be co-opted with that. And I suppose if that isn't a problem, that's a question I'd like to put to you, obviously slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it was an interesting observation I thought that I found with that parallel with Garland. If that reality, if your academic revolution isn't hijacked by the right realists, do you not also isn't there a problem that really critical social sciences are taking such a battering at the moment anyway, through the marketization of academia, through the closure of social sciences and humanities departments throughout the land, that ultimately we might end up with an elitist outcome of only elite Russell Group universities teaching students who are able to obtain scholarships and funding to go to those universities, and your South Banks, your Brightons, your Kingstons, where I went and had my most life-changing experience of learning these critical understandings, they'll be closed because ultimately they're being funding reductions, so on and so forth. And that runs completely counter to the left realist goal, which is working for the structurally working class. So that's just a few points that I was considering.
Splendid. Wow. Well, I like to be compared with Garland. I know my friend Simon Holsworth wouldn't want to be compared with Garland, but I actually think Garland's done some pretty important stuff, and not least in bringing sociology into the knowledge about the history as well, the history discipline, the history of the field of study of criminology. Fascinating about the whether I might usher in you know, the stormtroopers against any critical social science. I doubt it. I think the book won't sell because I don't think it pleases anybody. It's fascinating, I think, the stuff you're saying about identitarianism. Yeah, how its foremost critics are of very dubious populist, nativist tendencies. I guess I still think we do need to. I always believe that you've got to criticize your closest friends. I think the best arguments are with the people you share most in common with, possibly. So my book is virtually, yeah, it's a discussion with myself 20 years ago, in part. But as I say, I do still think that, you know, we really have to be careful about what type of debate we get engaged in. On that sort of highly contentious one about identitarianism and race and whiteness and stuff like that, I take some relief in coming across the work of Keenan Malik. Not such a black and white issue. I don't know if you know that book. I think it's a super book. And he's very much arguing against essentializing race because he thinks it panders to racist beliefs. It's ironic, you know, that race is now being seen as somehow as a certain essential features that different groups have. And I'd follow Malik in terms of arguing for the importance, if you like, of the modernist concern with universal rights and the sharedness of humanity, you know, which is very far away. So I think there'd be problem. I'm hoping the Trumpians and Braverman here, you know, would have major problems dealing up with what I'm trying to argue for in the book. Let's watch this space, I guess. If I start getting weird, I don't do social media, so I'm oblivious as to whether any of this might be happening till, as I say, I was quite surprised to get an abstract for the first time ever in 40 years rejected for a conference, when all it was about was to discuss the main findings of this book. That surprised me, really. I must admit, maybe I'm just getting paranoid. So I think the people who don't want to hear me might be my critical criminology friends, or maybe ex-comrades. Thanks, Orlando. That's ever incisive, and I like the stuff where you said about realism coming from, you know, back from Aristotle to Marx. I thought that's really fascinating. Though it is interesting, isn't it, that Das Kapital, you know, Marx wanted to dedicate it to Darwin, the science of evolution, you know.
Yeah, indeed.
To the extent to which Marx was also, in a sense, what we now call, you know, he believed in, you know, stages of human history, the teleological and arguably positivist in some ways. But we obviously didn't use those terms. But, he thought, and presume he thought, he was getting the truth, the laws of human evolution.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughtful answers, Gordon. And I suppose that my final point that I'd like to finish on, or ask you about, get your feelings on, I think that it's, as I said, I find your point very persuasive and compelling, and I'm sympathetic to that. a lot of critical criminologists are ultimately armchair philosophers that don't get out into the field. And again, if this wasn't being recorded, I could name particular examples that I have to deal with actually on a daily basis.
Send me them in an email.
Yeah, perhaps. But I ran this point to you in a tentative form when I last heard you speak in Cardiff. I think I'd like to bring it up again just because it actually is worthwhile. And that's really around your critique in chapter 7 that really uses Penny Green and the International State Crime Initiative as a case study on being the neo-evangelist, non-partisan side takers.
Yeah.
And which I don't necessarily want to confront that point, but I think that you could have used better examples for critical criminologists that don't do field work, that don't do sustained research. Because in the time that prior to your book being published, Penny Green's latest book has been published in 2021. They won funding in 2011 from the ESRC for just shy of $1 million. You were citing their 2015 work on the Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine state of Myanmar, Burma, as being relatively limited, only 136 interviews, only spent a year out there, etc. In the latter work that I was referring to, 5 researchers spent 3 to 4 years, again, in Burma, in Kenya, in Tunisia, in Colombia, in Papua New Guinea. And this is quite a sustained piece of work, winning the funding in 2011, getting into the field in 2012, being published in 2021. And for full disclosure, I was the research assistant on that work, and I was ultimately transcribing a lot of the interviews. And this was a sustained research process. This was serious field work. A lot of the interviews that I was getting sent to me when I was translating, transcribing them, sorry if I was saying translating, transcribing those interviews, the respondents had already been assassinated in the time lapsed between interview and me receiving the files and the coding. And that was a serious piece of field work that went on for a prolonged period. So I feel in some way it's regrettable that you use their work as being unempirically and unfield work-wise rigorous, because I would definitely contest that. You allude to Stan Cohen's work in States of Denial, which of course is classic work in that field. But obviously Stan is also, when he was alive as well, was an honorary fellow of the ISKI, so he was embedded in that, he was part of that. You were already discussing your route as a sociologist and how this brings and what impact that's had. Well, it's interesting, I find, that Penny Green ultimately is a professor of law and is the head of the law department at Queen Mary. So in some ways, I think that really, again, she isn't the target for critical criminology, because really, I think that she would probably deny that. Given the reams of critical criminologists out there in other departments, Bristol, for instance, and elsewhere, Liverpool, and so on and so forth. I think Penny and colleagues, including Professor Richard Falk at Princeton, who's another honorary member of ISKI and speaks regularly, he was the United Nations rapporteur to the occupied Palestinian territories, again, a professor of law. And I think that this colours the work of the state crime fraternity in quite an interesting light, that empirical work in the law profession, so to speak. And your critique of them becoming the academic critical mainstream, which perhaps you say tongue-in-cheek, or I'm not sure if you do or not, because of their prestigious, to quote you, chapter in the Oxford Handbook. I think it's somewhat unfortunate to refer to them as the mainstream, given if we consider sociological approaches to crime featuring the first edition of the Oxford Handbook and continuing ever since. Same with left realism, the same with community safety, some of your empirical background. Meanwhile, the state crime chapter appeared in the 5th edition in 2012, which you reference, the 6th edition in 2017, and I've just noted that the contents page of the forthcoming 8th edition, it's gone. So actually, it was just 2 editions. I'm not sure if that does constitute a mainstream. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, good points. I mean, I have to say, I mean, I could only obviously judge Penny and colleagues' research on what was available. I couldn't foresee what might come out in the book. I haven't read the book. I will get hold of it. I actually chose it because it was exceptional in actually doing empirical research. I do say that. In other words, I didn't want to just get at the easiest ones to critique. Okay. I think I can name names, likes of, I could easily have had a go at Phil Scraton, Joe Sim, their fellow travellers who know the truth before they even need to study it. So I think but what I found concerning, I guess, with the Penny Green's and colleagues' argument is they seem to know that they were on the side of the good, and that it was all about the state, and that it was definitely genocide at the time they were writing. And I just found it. I found the contrast with Michael Mann's. I don't know if you read Michael Mann's study of ethnic cleansing and genocide, which is comparative and historical, and I think is much more radical than Penny's work in terms of its making think about what these forms of conflict are to be understood and explained. So as I say, I just found it. I did find some of what they wrote somewhat self-aggrandizing. This is the world centre for state crime research. Says who? Says they. Yeah. Like be wary of too much hubris in what you do, really.
I suppose, I mean, I don't know myself because I've never been to a states of political violence and conducted field work. I've only done that from the comfort of the West Country, in Devon and Cornwall and Somerset, where there isn't, thankfully, too much genocidal tendencies going on. But one could speculate, I suppose, if you've spent 3 years dodging paramilitaries in refugee camps, that you might be more prone to less value neutrality than, say, Michael Mann, who conducted archival research from his armchair in Boston.
Sure. Well, yeah, California. So how did they get it through ethics committees?
Yeah, I don't
know.
know.
Literally dodging bullets and such like.
Yeah, they cross borders in rebel-held territories in Rakhine State.
Did they discuss that at all? How they actually got access and allowed to?
I don't know if they discuss it in the book. And when I got brought in to transcribe interviews, obviously ESRC had already. It was at that time the ISKI was based at King's College, so maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a fine one to talk when it comes to ethics, as Simon and Adam probably recall. So I couldn't really comment. I don't know how that happened, but I do know that the level of intensity of the fieldwork process with the second researcher that Penny went back out to Burma, conducted her PhD research on what was going on in Myanmar, and previous to that, she was a UN human rights lawyer, and the things that she experienced, actually, she now has such severe post-traumatic stress that she's had to leave academia entirely and is doing something that's that's that.
As I say, I could only go on what I read. I thought the other work that has tried to get in there and do empirical research associated with Carstead and Parmentier and their work on atrocity crimes, I just felt from reading their research that they seem to have a more complex take on the nature of state crimes and atrocity crimes, and that it's not all, I very much felt a top down analysis, But anyway, I'm sure I don't want to go up too much onto this because I'm sure it's not what probably most of the network are interested in, though. It's a fascinating point you make, I think.
Yeah, thank you for your answers.
I was going to sort of mention, have I been a bit too provocative and at times too what's the word? Brutally honest or brutally dishonest? I don't know. But have I been a little bit too wanting to have sparks flying? Just because I've felt there's been a lack of debate. It's like almost like, no, you don't go there. Don't go there because they're doing really good stuff. Yeah.
It all massively appeals to the precocious contrarian in me. So I have to say it's a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah.
And thanks for your answers, and thank you for speaking.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this afternoon, this evening as it is now.
Simon, did you? I saw your hand up briefly. Did you want to come in at all?
I was just sorry. Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points. One is throughout my research career, which has been basically dedicated to try to understand urban violence, and I've run up recurrently against closures. You know, I was accused of having to find the gang for the Metropolitan Police. I was accused of racism. I've been, you know, when I came into the field, I mean, no one was studying issues around why young black men were walking around with guns and knives. That had been closed down by Gilroy, with John Lee and Jock Young having the temerity to suggest it might be an issue. And they were closed down totally, if you remember the words, that they were using criminological theory to justify racism. The critical criminology closed down an entire realm of, you know, problematic issues, and basically silenced academic research in the field around, you know, Gilroy basically silenced research around black involvement in violence and violence in inner city areas, which was simply perceived through the lens of critical criminology as a social construction. You know, so this is the danger we face, I think, and this is what makes Gordon's work important, is realizing that, you know, we cannot, as realists and as critical realists, stand back and not engage in stuff which is problematic. And particularly today, when you actually find people that do engage by going to places where they're not supposed to go. For example, Kathleen Stock's book, Material Girls, where she was actually forced out of a post at university, having temerity to have an argument. And I think probably where we're going to go next, which is very dangerous, is what happens when people won't even debate with you. I mean, partly as social scientists, we're engaged in the business. We don't have final answers. We're always involved in a conversation. We can put a point and someone will contest it. That's the nature of our debate. But what happens when you move to the point where people will no longer even debate with you? And that's where it gets very dangerous. One final response back to your man and his arguments about Weber. I mean, I was taught Weber by Nikos Mouzedis, who was a Weberian Marxist. And he always presented Weber as basically acting as a corrective to Marx. That he thought Marxism was too dogmatic in a sense and wanted to open up other explorations, multiple determinations, which I always thought was at the core of critical realism. I mean, anyone who can write an essay like the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism to actually argue that capitalism is due to the unforeseen consequences of religious ethic on a bunch of nutters. And that's an incredibly bold brilliance that's sort of like at social science at its best. Whatever Weber is, he's never a social constructionist, I don't believe. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's but the issue of closure is a really rather scary one. I don't know whether what impact it has on most of the folks here are in the thick of it. Yeah, as teachers or researchers, I don't know whether it does feel like a constraint, or is it just that's what life is like, and you haven't known anything different. You have to make sure you don't. I presume you have to make sure you don't upset students.
Well,
the notion of not upsetting students, I can't believe it. You know, I made a career out of upsetting students, really, and then some of them enjoying it, and that might have been a bit masochistic, perhaps. But you know, it seems that I don't know. The younger generation that populating this network. You know, I'm sort of, I feel bloody hell, that must be really tough now. And how you square, you know, the idea that that social science is about conversation, unfinished conversations. We never get there. We're dealing with open systems, all the stuff that you quite rightly emphasize in critical realism. Then you're faced with actually increasing closures. You don't go there. Can't discuss it. You can't recommend this book. Well,
I always remember that classic paper that Joe Sims and Steve Toombs wrote, which is basically accusing anyone having temerity to go out there and do empirical research with the state, but feeding at the trough.
yeah, yeah.
Which provoked me to write a paper called Confessions of a Trough Worker, which was deemed unpublishable.
Yeah, I mean, I have written that I did feel that the likes of Steve and Joe, what they offer is impassioned irrelevance, and that's okay if you want to be impassioned and irrelevant to debates that actually change people's lives in the here and now. Fine, that seems more like a theocratic sort of theological approach rather than social scientific. But I'm getting to be a moany old man as we just reached 7 o'clock, and I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion. It's been some useful provocations, hopefully not too annoying. I certainly don't want to come over as dismissive of critical realism, given all the engagement I've had with it. But I think we also need to be critical of critical realism, don't we? What do we mean by what concepts work and what don't? It can't all work, surely. There must be some flaws, aren't there?
Because the beauty of critical realism is that it's fallibilism. It actually accepts that it's probably wrong. It's one of the main things why I find it so attractive, actually, precisely for that reason.
Yeah, exactly shared by Weber and Elias.
Got there first.
totally both fallibilists. I mean, if you read a little something, I've got a quote I think in the book where Elias talks about our knowledge. Like we're surrounded by an ocean of ignorance and unknowingness, and we've got little islands of bits of truth that we've got. But really, it's mostly. It's mostly the fallibility of most of our work, of course. Yeah. People who don't think their work is fallible are dangerous, aren't they? Have you had any?
I was going to say thank you very much. It's been a really, really enjoyable evening. Lots of smiles on our cult faces, shall I say? Thank you so much, and please feel free, Gordon, to attend future seminars. Yeah, thank you. Thank you from the network.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and keep up the good work. And I hope to stay involved in your discussions. You'll let me.
Yeah, you're more than welcome always.
That'll be fantastic, please. Really super discussion this evening, and I hope with your consent, Gordon, you might mind if we upload a version of this, so it's a part of the record. I think this is one of the really terrific things that Mark's doing on behalf of the network. It's such a building up a really important archive really of previous discussions, which people who haven't been able to make it this evening or have but want to go and remind themselves of what was said. Use it with other people for teaching purposes, research purposes, whatever. It's there, and that's a really productive thing that the network is trying to produce over and above just these monthly meetings, So and that's overwhelmingly, entirely down to Mark's fantastic efforts in setting up the website and maintaining it and uploading these. I am so very grateful to him for convening sessions and doing that really crucial work for us.
Brilliant.
Did we want to say a little bit finally something about next meeting?
Literally, it's going to be I think a free for all. We'll hold one in July for our network just to see where we want to go with it. The next academic year, we've got obviously David Elderpass, a few other people said they might give talks, but is that what we want? Obviously, me and Amha going to that critical realist early career researcher conference. What conferences next year do we want to get involved in, and the participation, what do we think it's working? Do we think it's not? So just an open discussion, really give some voice for a network, because I think we've had quite a few guest speakers, and like Orlando, you pointed out, I'm going around knocking on lots of doors at student academics that go, who are you? Yeah, they've been very gracious, like Gordon today, to spend some of their precious time. But yeah, so I think if we're up for it, to have a kind of a bit of a free discussion for July.
Right.
We all happy with that, yeah. Cool.
Yep.
That's what I'll do, and I'll send out the email.
Cheers.